Hey, back again. Um, Doing the video for three reasons, I guess. One being it's springtime and it's the time of year where I typically do my fuel filter and fuel line replacement. Second reason, it's April 15, 2020. And at this point in time, everybody's at home, quarantine. I live in Canada. I'm sure most of you watching, same idea, stay home, don't do anything. So it's also a good time to do this. But third reason I was doing this video, or I wanted to do this video, was because of a post I saw online. Somebody had posted an image of their Beetle on fire, and all they had written in it was, "This happened today." What followed was a flood of people just knocking the person and just claiming that they should have replaced fuel lines, filters, that sort of thing. And it got me thinking that people are assuming without really knowing the details of the incident. And the person who owned the vehicle, or the original poster, never came back to comment. So I don't know what the issue was. But it got me thinking that everyone focuses on fuel lines, fuel filters, when a lot of times the fires that occur have nothing to do with that. Sometimes everything is very well maintained and other things get overlooked. So after all that, I decided to do this video just as maybe an educational tool. I'm not a VW expert, but I have some experience with it. But I thought maybe if someone's just getting into VWs, or somebody who buys an old VW maybe assumes, oh, everything's fine, my mechanic will deal with it if anything happens. But your mechanic can't be around on a daily basis. And there are things that I personally look every time before I take my car out. Every time. And I'll go over some of that. I'll give you some ideas on what to look for, some signs that maybe something's about to happen. But most of the time, when the fires occur, it is a shock to the person driving it. Sometimes there's more to the story. And also the fact that if something happens, maybe the person wasn't aware that that even existed as an issue. So I'm hoping to maybe educate some people. For those of you who have way more experience than me with air-cooled VWs, feel free to comment. And if I missed something, or if I misspoke, definitely leave it in the comments, because the whole idea here is just to help everybody out, including me. Maybe I'll learn something too. I always do. I still do. The only I guess favor I'd like to ask is if you give a thumbs down to the video, 100% fine with that. I'm good with that. But don't just give it a thumbs down and then click away. Give a thumbs down and say why. Whether it's my explanation, whether you think I'm full of shit, I don't care. Just tell me why, and it'll help everybody, including me. So anyway, let's talk about some stuff in here. So getting into the engine bay here, like I mentioned, it's not always the fuel lines or the fuel filter. Obviously, if you are neglecting them, they will rot and blow off. Before I go out at any time, I'm always back here checking my oil anyway. So I run my fingers along the fuel line on the discharge side of my fuel pump. Right here, goes up to the carburetor. I just run my fingers along there at the top as well. Make sure that I don't get any fuel on there. There's no residual stuff on there that smells like fuel, because that could be an indication that there is some cracking going on underneath the wrap and it's seeping through. I have personally never seen that when I replace my lines every year. I'm sure if I left this for 5 years or something longer, especially with today's fuel, I very well could have this break on me, but I keep an eye on it. That's something I do before I go out each time. The other thing was I use the braided line or the covered line. A lot of people claim that never use that. They're trash. You can't see the rod underneath. That's all fine and good. However, personally, I've had great luck with it, great success. Many people have. And personally, I feel that if you're replacing your lines once a year or every 6 months, some people do it every 6 months, you're fine. All points that go into any port should have a clamp. I use the geared clamps. I know a lot of people say don't use those, they cut into the fuel line. And that's probably true, I guess. It might be true. You can use real fuel line clamps. But I've had success with this. A lot of people have. Again, you don't want to over torque them or whatever, because you can cut into it. So you got to be reasonable with it. As long as it's tight, you should be good. Another one that I want to talk about is the fuel filter placement. Man, what a debate that is. So my personal choice for placement is where the steel fuel line comes out of the tunnel, next to the gearbox essentially. I have the filter there. Some people like to put it here, going just before the carburetor. This is just my personal opinion, because a lot of people do it, very successful with it, never had fires in their life. Again, it's one of those situations where if you're on top of it and you're watching, you will not have any issues with that, I don't believe. Personally, I don't feel comfortable for one major reason. As this begins to plug off on the discharge side, you're building quite a bit of pressure here because it's requiring far more pressure to push fuel into the carburetor that is required for the demand. So as it plugs off, this pressure on this side of the filter, on the upstream side, will build up to the point, if this is starting to get loose and rot, you'll blow the line off, and there's your ignition source, or your fire. Here's your ignition source, spark here and heat, but there's your fuel. I like to keep my filters on the inlet side of the pump, which is this line here. For me, I have a steel line coming through my firewall, which is how it was done from the manufacturer. I just replaced that in kind. Some people like to run a hose all along, and that's fine. Again, keep an eye on it. And they put the filter on the inlet side of the pump. That's slightly better. But one needs to remember that when you're putting this together in the driveway, your car's not running. So everything looks nice and tidy in here, and your filter's sitting in a great spot. And then you start the car, everything looks great. Then you get in the car to drive, and then you get vibration. I'm going to move the camera here. You get vibration, and if you have a long fuel line coming along here and this thing's resting on the inlet side, it can slide over, get up against your riser, and melt through there, right? So if that sort of thing happens, obviously if you melt through the filter, you're pouring gas all the way through everything. So there again is your fuel. So it's one of those things where you can leave it in the engine compartment. I don't go on the internet and preach to people it's a bad place for it, because a lot have had great success with it. And it's when it's here, it's way easier than I have to jack the car up and get underneath, and it's a big pain in the ass. Not crazy, but it's kind of a pain. But if you're on top of it here, you should have no issues. It's fine. It's fine. But as a personal opinion, it's not ideal. So if I get a split down below where I have it currently, that fuel will just pour on the ground. It won't make it to the engine compartment. So I should technically be safe. Something else to consider is these ports that I talk about. When the carburetor one is probably the most important one I'm going to talk about. It happens up here the most. But that brass fitting on the original carburetors was just pressed in there. This particular carburetor is the original one for the car. Car's a 69. So I'm looking at a 51-year-old carburetor. And that's another thing, that if the fuel line or the fuel filter's here, there's a little more vibration and pulling on that port up there. What will happen, and I believe it's the main cause for fires, is not fuel lines and not filters, it is that port popping out of the carburetor. It's just a press in, so it just, over time, it just pops right out of the carburetor. So you're literally pumping fuel straight into the engine compartment. Again, there's your ignition, or your fuel for ignition. So what we do to help alleviate that, you can have that port threaded in. You can buy a newer carburetor, of course, which they are threaded at all times. Or you can do the safety wire method. I'll put a picture up right now for that. So the safety wire method essentially prevents the port from slipping out of the carburetor. That wire sort of hangs onto it, or keeps it from popping out all the way at least. It'll hold it in place. So eventually, you're up here feeling around before you go for your drive looking for a fuel leak. You'll feel a little bit of fuel there, so it'll drive you to investigate, and maybe that port has loosened off, and maybe you saved yourself a fire. Maybe it would have popped out if that wire wasn't there, but wires are excellent idea. And for that, I use this stuff right here. It's just a 20 gauge galvanized steel wire. Bends really easy, and it's plenty strong to hold that in place. Some people will do it also on the discharge of their fuel pump over here to keep this from popping off as well. The one I just thought about, I just cut the camera there and came back. The one I thought about, going back to the filters here, was glass filters. They look unreal. I guess if there was one time to use advice, and maybe some people with more experience can comment on this one, but very unpredictable glass, and many fires I've seen from people using glass filters in the engine compartment. Again, I believe it's more to do with how much vibration is actually happening when you're driving, more so than the cheap Chinese seals they have in there. But anyway, personally, I would avoid glass fuel filters. Another one that is really important, and people really overlook, I think, a lot of times, especially if you're new to VW, this one's pretty important. Where the metal fuel line comes through the firewall, you'll see it. If you're under the car, it'll bend up and go through the firewall, and I'll grab the camera in a second. I'll show you where it's coming through back here. There's a rubber grommet that belongs there, and a lot of times you'll see VWs, the grommet wears out. There's a lot of heat in that area. They dry rot, they crack, and then they break and fail, and that's fine for a short term. But what happens is the tin on the back will just rub on that fuel line that's coming through, and it will just wear through that fuel line, and it drops. If it holds through, it'll drop fuel onto, is that number 3 exhaust, and it's almost red hot there. So that's an instant fire as well. So I'll show you the grommet here. See if I can get that. The lighting's not the best, I'm sorry. And my camera's not the best either. Oh, there we go. Okay. Let's see if I can point. This is the fuel line, and right back there is the grommet coming through the tin. There we go. That grommet. You want to make sure that's in good shape. There's also a little support on the side of the shroud, the fan shroud. Come on, focus, focus. Right here, this support. What I do is I just cut a little piece of fuel line, and I wedge it in between the clamp or the bracket and the fuel line so that I don't get any rubbing there. So it'll wear through that rubber hose before it rubs through my metal fuel line that comes in. So again, if you're new to Beetle, to bugs, it's very important. So make sure that's there, and if it's not, just check the steel line when you do replace the grommet, and if it's got a little bit of scuffing on it, it should be fine. But yeah, just make sure that that's there. That's a big one. Gets overlooked. Fuel pumps. So everyone has their own thing. It's impossible for me to go over every fuel system that's out there and custom fuel systems that are out there. For me personally, I use just stock fuel pump, works on the motor. Other people have electric fuel pumps, and they'll get, the smartly put like a electric fuel pump cutoff switch under the dash hidden somewhere. So if somebody tries to steal their car, they get 100 feet down the road and runs out of gas, and that's fantastic. That if you have a fire, you look in the rear view, you see smoke coming out, car's losing power, it's dying, and kills itself, and then you panic. You get out of the car, and you leave your key still on. That pump will still be pumping, and if the problem is somewhere in the engine compartment, it's still going to pump fuel to the fire. So you're going to empty your extinguisher back there, and it's just going to be pouring fuel in there. So just something to remember if you're having a fire. If you have an electric fuel pump, take your key out of the ignition. Get that pump to stop pumping fuel. Fires can still happen. Biggest tool in your kit is this. Everyone should have one in the cab. Whether you drive a bus, a thing, a Beetle, it doesn't matter. Squareback, it happens. I hope to never use this. I hope I have the car for forever and I have the same extinguisher, even though they do expire. There are also fire suppression systems that bolt in, and if there's a fire, it melts through the plastic and blows the extinguisher agent into the engine compartment. I'll leave a link below for people who've never heard of that or seen that. Pretty cool system. I don't have one in the car or anything. Something that's a little bit tricky to explain, but I'm hoping I can. I just remembered this and I wanted to talk about it. Just another tip to hopefully help. When I bent the fuel line, I replaced all the fuel line coming through the firewall. And when I bent it and manipulated it to get it to the inlet side of my pump, initially I had to sort of pull the metal fuel line towards the pump to get my clamp on, so that when I let go, the fuel line was pulling away from the pump. It would be kind of ridiculous if I left it like that, or it was pulling away. So I bent it further up towards the firewall, towards the pump, which then allowed me to have to push the fuel line slightly away to get my fuel hose on and then clamp. So when I let go, the fuel hose or the fuel line was actually supporting itself and pushing towards the pump, which is more what you want. You want it to be, you don't want it pulling away and potentially pull that brass fitting out. You want it to sort of push in towards where the brass fitting sits. That way you have no pressure pulling in the outward direction, so you're not going to pull that thing out. I mean, you have safety wires if you're doing it. I didn't put safety wires on my pump, something I probably could do, but yeah, so you want it you don't want anything pulling on those lines. I'm trying to think of anything more that I can talk about. I talked about the brass fittings sometimes coming out. Clamps, I should probably update my clamps to something a little more appropriate, but I've been okay. Do your lines every year, maybe every 6 months, that's up to you. Try, if you can, put your fuel filter either on the outlet of the fuel tank itself or just on the outlet of the tunnel. Try to keep it on the inlet of the pump. If you don't and you want to keep it in the engine bay, that's fine. Just keep on top of it, that's all. Check your lines all the time, just like you check your oil. Just look around. Make sure that your grommet coming through the firewall there for the metal fuel line is intact and in good shape. Maybe add that little thing in the little clamp or the clip on the side of the shroud. That really helped me out. Try to, if you're gonna put your fuel filter in here, try to avoid having it so that it's hovering over your distributor, because if it sort of leaks a little bit and you even get fumes inside there, these are typically sealed, but if these are in bad shape, that spark could ignite something as well. One other fluke situation that I've heard of happening as well, fan belt. Check that. Check it often. I've heard of this actually snapping off, whipping around, and yanking these lines out, just tearing this apart. So there's another potential source. Finally, just to get back to the beginning here, like if somebody has a fuel fire or a car on fire, like the last thing we want to do is bash them for it. They're already feeling like shit. Maybe it was something they didn't know. Maybe it was one of the things I talked about. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe they blew a valve and it backfired up through the carburetor and spilled fuel everywhere and you got a fire. I saw a post of a guy who literally just finished restoring his car. Everything was absolutely perfect and it caught on fire. Don't know what happened. I don't know the story, but it happens. Battery, you know, cover your battery so you don't get that contact under the seat. Crazy things like that. Yeah, let's just help each other out. Make sure to leave a comment, good or bad, don't care. If I'm full of shit, tell me so. I'm happy with that. If you see something in here, other than a lot of people hate my shroud because they, whatever, and they hate my filter. That's the car runs perfect. I guarantee I can start it right now. Other than those choices that I make because they're the style choices I like, if you see something in here that fuel-wise, topic-wise, or not, feel free to comment. That's all I got, I think, unless I come up with something else. But take care of yourselves, stay home, stay healthy, and we'll see you soon.